UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jenn Durrell.
Hey, baby.
Hey, baby.
I almost didn't want to do the hey, baby thing tonight. As much as I adore you, it feels funny and almost inappropriate for this interview. This is a hard one for me to introduce for a number of reasons. One, we've already recorded the episode, and I know the things which I didn't touch on that I would have liked to, but I also didn't touch on some of those things because they'd already been talked about extensively. And I won't do my normal saving the guest's name until the very end. We have on the show today Richard Doty, who is probably the person I've most been looking forward to interviewing since we've started this show. A lot of our audience will know who Richard is, but some of the audience mightn't. He's an ex-special agent of the Air Force's Office of Special Investigations, who arguably, depending on who you believe or how you interpret the facts, might be the person single-handedly most responsible for what Jerome Clark called the Darkside Hypothesis, or what I'd say now is traditional UFO belief, or traditional X-Files type UFO belief. In other words, this idea of an elaborate UFO mythology involving secret underground alien bases and treaties between hostile extraterrestrials and the US government, and brutal cattle mutilations, and all of those kind of stories originate, at least on the surface, with a group of people in the 1980s. And amongst that group of people, the late 70s into the 80s, is Richard Doty. And it's difficult to explain it very quickly, but I'll try to. There's an incident called the Bennewitz Affair, where Paul Bennewitz, who was basically a businessman working in tech opposite Kirtland Air Force Base, was where his office was, in New Mexico, believed he was intercepting extraterrestrial transmissions coming from that base, and also filming flying saucers at the base. Anyway, when he contacted the base about this, because Bennewitz was a good patriot, apparently some of the things he was looking at were actual, genuine, military, advanced technological secrets. So a spin operation was begun to try to convince Bennewitz that all he was seeing was extraterrestrial technology and not actually something that was the Air Force's. And that's where Richard Doty, who headed the operation, comes in. And different people argue, like there's a very vocal school which suggests that somehow Richard Doty is responsible for Bennewitz being driven insane, because Bennewitz, who went wholeheartedly down the rabbit hole after he had confirmation from the base that there was an extraterrestrial presence, ended up in a mental asylum. But there's also every very real possibility that Bennewitz already believed a lot of these things and was already quite unstable. So I think I always have thought it's been unfair that somehow people have pointed at Richard Doty as the sole person responsible. But there's somebody else, or there's a number of other figures who are vital to this broader mythology as well. And one of them is William Moore. William Moore was particularly a very famous ufologist in the late 70s and throughout the 80s. And he, with Charles Berlitz, wrote the famous Philadelphia Experiment book. And more pertinently to this conversation, he wrote the first modern book on the Roswell Incident. Now everybody knows what the Roswell Incident was. Going forward, he became an asset of Richard Doty and I guess a general Air Force intelligence asset. And at the 1989 MUFON Symposium confessed on stage that the Air Force, and he might have mentioned other intelligence agencies, were using him and people like him to solicit information from the UFO community, and also running disinformation campaigns. Now, William Moore wasn't only the popularizer of Roswell, which had all but been forgotten after 1947 until that book came out in the late 70s or early 80s or whenever it was. He also was the person who, along with a colleague who's a film producer or TV producer, Jamie Shandera, allegedly received the MJ-12 documents. And the MJ-12 documents are probably one of the most talked about pieces of potential UFO evidence since the modern UFO phenomenon began. And what they are basically is these allegedly top secret leaked documents which talk about almost a secret study panel, or some might even say secret government, put together to deal with what was perceived to be a UFO presence after a saucer was retrieved in Roswell, New Mexico with dead alien crew aboard in 1947. So we have now William Moore, Jamie Shandera, and Richard Doty at the heart of the Roswell story, the MJ-12 story, and the story involving Paul Bennewitz, which spun into the belief that there was an extraterrestrial base under Dulce, New Mexico. The story doesn't stop there. Linda Moulton Howe, who was one of the most famous UFO investigators at the time and made a significant documentary. She was originally a famous journalist, but she made a significant documentary on cattle mutilations. Also had an encounter with Richard Doty where, according to Linda Moulton Howe, Richard Doty showed her a document that sounds in some ways similar to the MJ-12 documents and also had information suggesting that perhaps, I believe, humanity might have been the result of some type of extraterrestrial biological experiment or breeding program back in the day. So that came from Richard Doty as well into Linda Moulton Howe's hands. So we see Richard involved in a lot of these things, sometimes at the center, sometimes on the fringes, and then later, I think this was by the 2000s, there's a story about an exchange program where supposedly the US military swapped extraterrestrials for 12 Air Force servicemen and or servicewomen who went to the Zeta Reticuli star system to a planet called Serpo and spent some time there. If anybody's seen, as most of the audience have, the ending of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, this would be where that movie then went, where we see the humans go with the aliens. Now, Richard Doty has also been accused of being behind the release of the Serpo documents, which is also something Richard denies, although he, as we'll see in this interview, he does happily say that he commented on it and gave his 2 cents worth and had heard similar stories himself, but he wasn't the creator of the Serpo documents. So, as I reiterate, I think this is the most important interview we've done so far, and certainly the one I was most looking forward to sinking my teeth into. It's a difficult topic matter, but I think it's a fascinating conversation, and I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Oh, yes. It was quite interesting, but I didn't say a whole lot because I wanted to make sure that you had your moment with Doty.
I should apologize for that. I did tend to jump all over it, and we don't talk about the Bennewitz Affair a lot because I think it's been done to death in films like the excellent Mirage Man and Greg Bishop's book Project Beta, not to mention several interviews with Richard in the past. But I think there's some real nuggets in this interview, and I know it's something I would have been fascinated myself to listen to. So without any more of my blathering, which this must be the longest intro in Talking Weird history so far and maybe ever, let's just jump straight down the rabbit hole with one of the most important personalities in the history of UFO belief, and arguably its most notorious, Richard Doty. I was talking to Jen before we called. In fact, we were talking yesterday, Richard, and I was telling her how I think this interview with you is the most important that we've done so far and is likely, in my opinion, to be the most important interview we'll probably do on the show in years. So no pressure on any of us. But as somebody who spent, I don't know, almost a decade studying UFO belief, and as a social scientist, as an historian, I'm not qualified to say what's real and what's not real. What fascinates me is where beliefs come from and how they're disseminated and how they become popular and what they reflect culturally. But I was going over my PhD dissertation, which I haven't read for years before I was going to do this interview with you. And I knew I'd spoken about you and William Moore in there. And it was fascinating to go back and look at it and how I point out. And I think I use the term, which I rarely use in an academic piece, I think. And it essentially said, I think this is, the turning point of UFO belief. There was the idea, and you're free to correct me if I'm wrong, and I'll stop waffling in a minute, that somehow you and William Moore and your involvement in the Paul Bennewitz Affair, and then I suppose with the mythology around Doty and interactions with Linda Moulton Howe, somehow this was the key to what Jerome Clark called the Darkside Hypothesis, which I suppose is what most people today would just think of as common X-Files type UFO belief. I almost can't help but think that maybe it's because of your involvement in the emergence of those beliefs, which also caused the vilification that you received in the UFO community when there was that massive reaction against you and William Moore after his announcement at the MUFON conference in 1989, and from other revelations or accusations by Linda Moulton Howe and other folks in the UFO community. I mean, I always interpreted that you were just doing your job as Air Force counterintelligence, and that part of that job seemed to have included spinning UFO stories to protect matters of national security. But why I think there was, and sometimes still is, so much animosity and blowback from the UFO community over the revelations regarding you and Moore and the Bennewitz Affair and the other stuff that's come to light was because we're talking about beliefs. And there almost seemed to be some kind of cognitive dissonance. I mean, a lot of people in the UFO community probably, even at a subconscious level, felt that their belief system that they'd invested so much into was under attack, and that their beliefs had probably been played with or were manipulated. So did you ever have that feeling that maybe the anger aimed at you was a reaction to people's beliefs being threatened more than anything else?
Well, I guess you depend on who you're talking to. If you're talking to a critic, then of course that's what they would say. If you were a strong believer in the subject of UFOs and ETs, Bill Moore's revelation in 1989 really upset them. They realized at that time that years before, the intelligence community had agents or spies within every UFO civilian collection group in the nation. And I think that upset them the most, knowing that everything that they were hearing or everything that they had seen or read from MUFON and APRO and CAUSE had been penetrated by U.S. intelligence. I think that's what upset them.
Right, I think that probably is the case. Now, I know Jen had some things before we get deep into it that she wanted to ask you about some current revelations with the Pentagon release videos. Did you want to talk to Richard about that for a minute, Jen?
Oh, I was just curious if you had seen the release of the videos that they had out on the internet.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that's just a drop in a barrel. I think that there's probably 1,000 more out there that they're holding back on. But I think it's interesting. It's a form of disclosure, and let's hope that there's more forthcoming. But I find them to be very interesting.
Yeah.
Hopefully, there's more to come.
Yeah, that would be really neat.
I've listened to a number of interviews lately with you in the lead up to this, and I think people often ask you the wrong questions, and maybe it's the wrong questions from my perspective. You've denied being behind the release of the MJ-12 documents, and you've denied being behind the release of the Serpo, and I believe you when you say those things. But I think what people should be asking you is, you've certainly said things which are supportive of what is in those documents, like independently of you being responsible for the release of those or not. You've talked about the MJ-12 documents, and you've talked about something similar to the Serpo exchange program. So are those things that you feel comfortable talking about now? Or?
Sure. I don't have anything to hide regarding either subject matter, the MJ-12 documents or the Serpo story. We start with the MJ-12 documents. What I've said in the past is that the information contained in those documents, some of which I knew about before, was accurate. I mean, there's some things in there that is accurate. Now, are the documents real, or were they manufactured based on accurate information? Yes, I think they were. I mean, I went through two investigations, FBI investigations in 1987 and 1989, because people were accusing me of releasing classified information or creating those documents. And I cleared both investigations. I passed polygraphs, which showed that I didn't create them. I didn't know who created them. I had an idea who created them, but I didn't know factually who created them. But there's a lot of information in those MJ-12 documents that's fact. Mm-hmm. And I knew about it. And I was briefed back in 1978 into the program. And so I knew fact from fiction. And a lot of information in those MJ-12 documents was factual. And that's what I stated. Now, as far as Serpo goes, that's an entire different subject. I got involved in that in 2005 or so, sometime in 2005. I had spoken with a man in May of 2005 who was a retired intelligence officer with the Defense Intelligence Agency. I was in Washington, D.C. for a funeral of a colleague of mine who served in intelligence for many years. And during the post-burial, we got together, there's several of us, and he asked me about a incident that happened in 1965 and what I knew about it. Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, I wasn't around in 1965. I was just a young guy, and 12 years old or 13 years old in 1965. So he said, well, maybe your dad or your uncle knew about it. My dad and my uncle both served, and it's well known that they were Air Force. My uncle was a Project Blue Book investigator, and my dad was a colonel in the Air Force in intelligence. I said, well, I can ask him, but I was interested. I said, well, tell me more about it. And then he told me the entire story. We sat there at the end of this bar for probably 4 hours, and he told me the whole story of what he knew about it. And I said, wow, that's fascinating. I never heard about it. I never heard that. Well, I said, I heard something once a long time ago, probably 1980 or 81. I'd read something about some kind of an exchange program that was either planned or that had occurred, but it was highly classified. And there was only a small sentence in one paragraph regarding that. And I never read anything else about it. And I told him about that. And he said, well, I think that's the case. Well, then jump to November of 2005. This guy by the name of Victor Martinez, who was putting out a newsletter or through email and a stream about UFOs and about different things, started a release on this subject of Serpo. And I think the first release was sometime in around the 1st of November, and he just carried on, and he identified a person who was sending him this, and the emails were coming out of Washington, D.C. based on the header on the emails, and he made that public. Well, over a period of 6 or 8 or 10 months, these things came out, And I was asked to comment, and I put my 2 cents in. I commented on a lot of the information that was in the that I knew about, or I'd heard about, or I thought. I mean, it was my own beliefs on some of these things. There was a lot of stuff in Serpo that I didn't believe, the actual number of people that went and so forth. But I just added my commentary to a lot of the different emails that were coming and going, and there were thousands and thousands of people getting involved in this and putting their 2 cents in. And then suddenly, sometime in 2006, a guy who we later found out who he was, he came forth, so to speak, on the internet and said, "I know all about this, and I have film and I have recordings of the commander." And so everybody got interested in this. And this guy started sending Victor what he knew in these logs, these captain logs and so forth. And that carried on for probably up until 2012 or so. And then it suddenly stopped.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And of course, at different UFO conventions, people immediately brought up my name. "Oh, your name, you must be involved in this. You must have created it. You must have wrote this." I tell you what, if I would have written this thing, this Serpo, I would be a millionaire right now, because that reads better than a science fiction book. Right. And I, you could, if you would have marketed it right way. I know there was a book written about it. You could have written probably 10 or 12 different books in a series on this.
Yeah.
So it was ridiculous that I wrote it. I mean, number one, I don't think I was smart enough to wrote all that stuff and in that type of chronological order.
Yeah.
I mean, they gave me a lot of credit for something I couldn't probably have done. Mm. So no, I didn't have anything to do with the creation of it. I certainly put my 2 cents in on it, but that's it.
Speaking of chronological order, I was going to go back to some of your earlier days in the Air Force. But before I do, I know that there's some contention over your involvement in the black world of UFOs exempt from disclosure by Robert Collins. I know you're credited as, I think, being a contributor or a co-author, but I know in the past you've said that that's not the case. So anything I talk about from that book, which you had nothing to do with, please feel free to tell me, because in that book, and I don't think I've read it or heard it anywhere else, there's a story from your early time in the Air Force when you're in Indian Springs Air Force Base and you see a massive disc-shaped craft rolled out from a hangar. Is that a true story?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Wow.
Yeah, that was true.
The part of that fascinated me most was that you said it was around that time you were approached by somebody in civilian clothes at the base who identified themselves as a Mr. Blake. And they were interested in you, and this goes back to the chronological thing, and you mentioning your father, Charles, and your uncle, Ed, and that they were conscious of the fact that both of those relations of yours had been involved in UFO projects in the past. And that individual, Mr. Blake, also came back when you were doing, or you were undergoing, a security clearance involving UFO projects later in your Air Force career. Is that correct, too?
Yeah, that's true. I didn't know it at the time, but I was groomed for the intelligence service. And I was, when I left the regular Air Force and went to college, I was also approached by, not Mr. Blake, but, and that was just a pseudonym. It was, his name wasn't Blake. I was approached by another person who steered me into the intelligence arena, into OSI. So, yeah, I was, I guess, a little naive and ignorant at the time. But then once I got in, I realized that there were some things that were steered my way. Yeah, that happened.
Yeah, I find it fascinating that there is that family history. And was it something you were aware of ever growing up? Or I think you've had conversations with your uncle and father after your military career, but was there a time when you were growing up that or before you entered the Air Force, that you were conscious your father or uncle were involved in the UFO field in that capacity?
You know, to tell you the truth, I was never interested in the subject growing up. My brother, John, was. He read everything he could get his hands on regarding UFOs growing up. I remember we roomed together and we had bunk beds, and he was older than me, and he bought the first George Adamski book that had come out, and he sat there and he read the whole thing from cover to cover, and he wanted me to read it. I looked at the book and I thought, I'm not interested in the subject. He would go down to the local news store and buy the True magazines, the old True magazines that had articles about UFOs. But I was never interested in it. I just never had it. I had other interests. I loved Westerns. I read almost everything that Zane Grey ever written. And so I was that side of the coin, but I wasn't interested in the subject. So, no, growing up, I don't think I ever had a conversation with my dad or my uncle about the subject at all. Of course, I didn't know what my dad did. I mean, for many years, I didn't know he was even in the Air Force. He wore civilian clothes, as most intelligence officers did. I remember when we moved from one base to another once, he had to become, he had to take a career broadening program assignment as a squadron commander. And that was actually the first time in probably 8 or 9 years I saw him in a uniform.
Oh, wow.
So, and so I didn't, and my uncle, he was stationed at other bases. So we didn't have contact all the time with him, during family reunions or something like that. We would have contact, but no, I never had a conversation with either one of them about the subject until after I had left the service and the government service, and before each of them passed away. I had many conversations with him, but not during my young life. No.
And did you then have discussions when you spoke to your uncle or when you spoke to your father about the type of experiences that you might have had when you were in the service with the UFO topic?
Oh yeah, we had. My dad was not. He had very, very little investigative work or access to the UFO stuff. My dad was more. He spoke Russian. We spent a long time, a number of years in Europe. He was the human side of intelligence, but he had very little access to that. My uncle, on the other hand, had a lot. So I had more conversations with my uncle about what he did during his career and what I did during my career. We had, hours and hours of conversations about it. And there's a lot of things that he told me that he didn't know that could still be classified that he didn't want to talk about. He spoke about it in a roundabout way, but he didn't actually give me all the nitty-gritty details about some of the things he did. Now, some of the things that he mentioned during our conversations, I knew about it. And I said, well, you talking about such and such case or such and such case? And he said, oh, yeah, you know about it. And I said, yeah, I was briefed into it. Then we would discuss it. There's some things that I'm sure he went to his grave about that he wouldn't talk about.
Huh. And is that how you met Richard Helms, the ex-CIA director, through your father? Because I think that you knew Helms, right? And you've also said that he was the actual Falcon, which was the code name of one of the main members of, I guess for lack of a better term, this UFO whistleblower group that was known as the Avery. And the Falcon is also this mysterious figure that you yourself have been accused of being.
Yeah. I met him through my dad, and it was I knew him from a social gathering. He was a friend of a friend of my dad's, and then I was at a social gathering when I was introduced to him, and this was after he left. I mean, he was the director of CIA way back in 66, something like that, until 72 or 3.
Mm-hmm.
I don't recall the exact years. But anyways, this was years later. This was in the I think the late 70s. He had already retired, and we were a social gathering, and I was introduced to him. And I don't know, for some reason, he took a liking to me. He knew what I did. He, we sat and talked about a lot of different things. And then It was a couple years after that he opened up, not to me, but to another person who then came to me about the subject of UFOs.
Huh.
And when I first met him, that subject was never discussed. He told stories about, just fascinating stories about spying and different things that had occurred inside the Soviet Union during the 60s and the early 70s. And I was fascinated by that. And most of our discussions during the first several meetings we had were about that. The subject of UFOs didn't come up until a couple of years later when I was in Washington, D.C., and I was there on business, and I just decided to call him and see if he wanted to go to dinner with me. And he answered the phone at his house. He lived in Washington, a suburb of Washington, and he said, "Sure, I'd love it." And he said, "Well, why don't you come over to my house for dinner? My wife is getting ready to make dinner, and there's always enough. So why don't you come over to my house?" And I said,
Wow.
"Oh, that would be fantastic." So that's what I did. And I went over there and we sat and we had a nice dinner. His wife made a nice dinner, and afterwards he always smoked a cigar and had brandy. I don't drink brandy or a cigar, but we went out on the patio, it's a little patio, and that's when everything opened up about the subject.
And Helms wanted to move towards disclosure. Was that the situation?
Well, he knew what I had done. He knew and I never told him this, but somebody did, or he was being briefed. He knew about the Bennewitz incident, and he knew about another incident that had happened prior to the Bennewitz incident that I was involved with, and he knew about it. I was somewhat surprised that he knew. I didn't ask him how he knew, but he seemed to know about it, and I thought, well, okay, you know about it, and then we talked about it, and we talked a great deal. I probably shouldn't have, because I didn't know if he would still have the clearance or not. But there's a lot of things in the Bennewitz case that was still classified that we talked about, and he opened up to me about what he knew. He said, "Well, let me tell you about the early days of the agency when we realized that we were being visited." And I'm paraphrasing him, but he said the Air Force kept us pretty well briefed, and we had a lot of contacts within the Air Force that was keeping us briefed about the subject. And I was really fascinated by it. And some of the things that we were collecting within the CIA proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that these UFOs were extraterrestrial.
Wow.
So that, of course, got me quite interested, because I knew what he was saying was factual. And then he met other people within this aviary that I didn't set up, but somebody set up. And Jamie Chandera and Bill Moore and some other people set this up. And in order to keep his name very, very secretive, some of the people that knew he was involved decided to put the Falcons label on me to cover him up. And that's why they decided, because a lot of information that was coming to the aviary was going through me from him.
Okay.
And there's another character that is involved in this. He's still prominent in the world. He's not even an American citizen. He lives overseas, and he's a very prominent person overseas. His name has never, ever been disclosed, and I'm not going to disclose it, but he was very good friends with Richard Helms in the early days of the agency, because he helped the agency in a number of different ways because of his position in a particular country.
Okay.
And so that person, who is still alive, still lives in Europe, and still is a prominent person in Europe, that person had quite an extraordinary experience with a craft that had landed in a remote location in his country. And so that's why he is still, to this day, fascinated with the subject and is still involved in it.
there's so many things I could ask you just based on that. But can I ask you something else? Was Harry August Rositsky also a Falcon at some stage? Is that correct? Or
No, not
Okay.
as far as I know. I mean, I didn't name anyone, so I don't know if somebody named him Falcon or something else. He was peripherally involved. He was somewhat of a person that some within the Aviary went to for advice or an explanation on something, but he wasn't the key element in the Falcon story. It was Richard Helms.
No, that's my understanding too. But one of the reasons I brought him up is I had heard his name, and I also know that you mentioned that your father was a Russian linguist, and I know that's part of the Rositsky background as well. He was this spy master come linguist, and I think his understanding of Soviet relations and Russia played a big part in, various Cold War decipherings and things. So I don't know if you knew him through your father as well or not, but that's one of the reasons I was asking.
Yeah, I knew of him. Yeah, I knew him. Yes, I definitely knew him. Not through my father, though. But I knew him, yes.
Now, while we're on the Falcon thing, I know it's probably contentious, but I have to ask, were you the person who was filmed in shadow and then had a voice modulation applied to their voice so you couldn't really recognize the voice, and called the Falcon in the 1988 TV special UFO Cover-Up Live?
No. That's just that. I have to laugh because when that was taped live, I was in the New Mexico State Police Academy in Santa Fe. I was a cadet in the academy, and I was in a closed, secure environment. Didn't even have access to a phone. So it would have been impossible for me to be that person online. I mean, I just laugh. I mean, it's so ridiculous because there were so many people. I mean, I can name Phil Klass, Bruce Maccabee, it goes on and on. The number of people that really dug into that so deeply. Because they said, well, that's a lie. You were there. We have evidence. You were in Hollywood and you did this. And I said, well, the lie is coming from you guys because I could not possibly blend. Well, when Phil Klass, we checked it all out and realized it and got the confirmation from the state, the academy that I was there and I was, in a closed environment. And then they changed their subject. They changed their minds and said, well, you might have recorded it before. Well, I couldn't have recorded it before because it was live. And the producer said the person was behind this camera in the back of the stage or wherever it was recording it. And so it could not possibly been me. So that's the fact.
Okay. Is it possible, or do you think, so I'm sure you've seen the show, and I saw it when it was aired back when I was in my, late teens. We even got it in Australia, and it was one of the shows which I suppose first kind of drew me into some of that darker, UFO stories which were emerging at the time. But anyway, do you think it's possible that Bill Moore and Jamie Shandera, who were the two UFO researchers who both introduced and vouched for the Falcon on that show, might have fed whoever that Falcon was information that initially might have come from you? Because some of the things the Falcon says are very similar to some of the things that you say or at least the things which are attributed to you in the Black World of UFOs book about the extraterrestrials, or the Ebens as they're called in that show, and also what the Falcon says about the famous Cash Landrum UFO incident, and the show is very similar to some things you said elsewhere. And both of those stories seem to be based on insider knowledge. No,
the person that was claiming to be me a Falcon was Robert Collins. That was him. He was the one on UFO Live.
Was he really?
That was Robert Collins.
I didn't know that at all.
Yeah, I thought everybody knew that. I mean, it came out about 4 or 5 years ago that he denied it initially, And he said, well, I'm not going to say whether I was or not. I think that was his answer on this.
Huh.
On some, he was interviewed on, I don't know, maybe it was Coast to Coast, or he was interviewed, and he said, when he was confronted, because I told people, yeah, it was Robert Collins, because him and I don't get along, and then he denied it initially, and then he said, well, I'm not going to say one way or the other. But it was him.
Fascinating. But there is something else attributed to you in the Black World of UFOs book by Collins, and it seems as significant as anything released in the Serpo papers or the MJ-12 documents or anything that the shadowy Falcon might have revealed in UFO Cover-Up Live. And that's an experience you had back in 1983. And according to that book, you were present when an Air Force colonel interviewed EBE-2, which is short for Extraterrestrial Biological Entity Number 2. And that's an alien supposedly held in custody by the US government. And the book also implies that interview was conducted telepathically. Is that story true?
No, that was when I was assigned to Area 51. Well, that's what you call it. Official name back then was Detachment 3 Air Force Flight Test Center, Groom Lake.
Mm-hmm.
But Area 51, I was there. I served there, and what I saw was supposedly a closed circuit feed. I was in another room. I was in another section. I didn't actually see this even face to face.
Okay.
He was being interviewed in another location on what I was told was a closed circuit television camera.
Wow.
And that's what that pertained to. I wasn't there in front of him, and I didn't see him live. No.
Was there a robot built to resemble that ET? This is again from that book, which was referred to as Entity 3.
A robot?
Yeah, that same book in that account, which is, and again, I know there's a lot of contention over who wrote what in that book, but in that description of you witnessing that interview, at the end of the description, it says, and also there was a robot which had been built supposedly by us or by the US military, when I say us, which resembled that entity. And it was called Entity Number 3, but it was actually a robot. It wasn't a biological entity.
There was a robot. Yeah, there was the military, a particular contractor out there at Groom Lake had manufactured a robot. I mean, it was really a very, very sophisticated robot that looked similar to an ET, and it was going to be mass manufactured. The idea, I mean, the project, it was under DARPA.
Wow.
It was going to be mass. You know what DARPA is, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay. It was going to be mass manufactured and used in the military. But that never happened. They built, I don't know how many. They built some. There was one that looked almost identical to the Eben, and then there was another one that looked more hideous looking. That I don't know whatever happened to that one. But the first one they built was so realistic. I mean, if you saw it, it looked real until it started moving, and then you could determine it wasn't. It was a robot based on the movement of it.
Gosh.
But no, that's actually.
The two most, and I'm sure you have, and in fact I've heard you mention that you have some problems with Mirage Men, but I think the two most interesting, or maybe the two most important UFO documentaries of the last 5-10 years, you're a key figure of both of them, and that's obviously Mirage Men, where you are the key figure. And the other one's the Stephen Greer documentary, Unacknowledged. What a powerful documentary that is. In that, you make a rather, and I know there's aspects of it that you can't talk about it, but I could not mention it, is that you said sometimes the Air Force, or maybe it was another government department, had staged something resembling abductions or ET visitations using people who might have been malformed or had some kind of physical disability or physical strange appearance to act like extraterrestrials in, I suppose, a disinformation operation. Is that something you can talk about at all? Or?
Well, yeah, I wasn't personally involved in any of that, but the Air Force had a particular section around Washington, D.C. that hired or contracted people to do that, to hoax an abduction. And there was complicated reasons why they were doing it. It wasn't something they just went out and did it randomly, saying, we're going to go fool some people today and pretend we abducted somebody. It wasn't anything like that. It was legitimate intelligence operations for a particular reason, that they would try to fool some person because he or she was a target of intelligence. And so they were going to hoax an abduction. And the one case I can talk about, because it's been written about on the internet by a particular person some years ago, was this person who they suspected to be a Soviet spy. And what they did was they abducted him with these people that had some kind of deformities, had maybe a deformed face, or had some kind of accident that mutilated their skin or something. And then they held this person to get information out of him. And that was because they thought he was a Soviet spy. And that happened, I think, in the 70s. And I wasn't involved in it. There's nothing I ever did there, but I knew about it. So that was one case. And then there was other cases involved. But there had to be a reason to do that. It wasn't, they didn't just go out and randomly abduct people that, innocent people. So that's the story behind that.
Wow. There's a thought-provoking book that I actually hadn't looked at for years, but I had to pick it up before this interview because I thought to myself, I just have to ask Richard Doty about it. And that's Jacques Vallée's Messengers of Deception. In that book, Vallée suggests that maybe the UFO phenomenon might be being used or manipulated for some kind of political control or maybe social change by some unnamed political or even occult organization. Now, things like the Paul Bennewitz Affair, well, I guess we haven't really even gotten into that, but mind you, I think it's been gotten into enough in many of your previous interviews you've done. But I understand that, and I understand the mechanisms and motivations that were behind that affair. I think that's pretty obvious and understandable. I mean, there's the protection of military secrets by creating a UFO story or letting, I guess, a pre-existent UFO story spin. And similarly, I guess it's even on the historical record now that the CIA in the 1960s, I think they realized that something like, 60% plus of all UFO sightings were actually people witnessing flights of the U-2 spy plane. And obviously the CIA were happy for that story to just keep spinning. So there's obvious examples, as you well know, Richard, of government agencies just letting a UFO story spin, or even starting a little spin themselves and letting the UFO community do the rest to keep it spinning. And that makes sense. I get that. But were you ever aware, either when you were in the Air Force or since that time, of some other UFO disinformation program, maybe beyond just protecting national security or military technological secrets, but to enact some kind of broader political or social control?
No, not at all. I read his book, and it doesn't. I don't agree with much in there. I didn't know if it happened. I didn't know about it. I was never briefed into it. But there are so many loopholes in that thought process of his, or his theory, that people would have had to been. There would have been thousands and thousands of people involved in that, and his theory, and they would have been brainwashed, and they would have had to been. Something would have had to happen when they left the service or left intelligence to keep their mouth shut about it. So I don't know. I don't agree with him. I just don't agree with it.
Okay. Obviously, I had to ask because you're probably the only person I'm ever going to get to talk to in my life who potentially could have any inside track info on something like that. Now, going from that heavy story to a lighter story, I guess, and this is also from the Collins book, The Black World of UFOs, and it's also talked about by Falcon in the UFO Cover-Up Live documentary, and in the Collins book it's attributed to you, is there were certain things known about these extraterrestrial biological entities. Things like they liked all kinds of music, but Tibetan music was their favorite because it was closest to their own. They had simple digestive tracts, so they had to eat a rather simple diet, but their favorite snack was strawberry ice cream. All of these kind of details, are they words that have been put into your mouth, so to speak? Or are these things that you've actually commented on, having found out about them in some kind of intelligence briefing?
No, the strawberry ice cream thing stemmed from a statement that was in a document that was leaked some years ago. Bill Moore leaked it. That had to do with a handler, Eben's handler, back in the 1950s when the lone survivor of the Roswell crash, the EVA 1, he had a very simple digestive system, and they were trying to find foods that he could tolerate. And one of the things that the handler tried, no, I'm sorry, it wasn't Bill Moore, it was Linda Howell that leaked this. Okay. Anyways, one of the things that he could drink was milk, a certain type of milk. I think it couldn't be something. It couldn't be either homogenized or pasteurized, something or another, but it was milk. Mm-hmm. And the handler, who Linda Howell later interviewed some years later after Eben had died, but thought that, well, maybe he could eat ice cream. And so the only ice cream that was available in that setting where they had him held was strawberry ice cream. So they gave him strawberry ice cream, and he liked it. That's how that story went. Huh. And it changed a lot over the years, but that's where it came from, and that even could tolerate. So they tried strawberry ice cream, and he liked it. So
fascinating. Is there something that you can talk about called Operation White, which supposedly was part of preparing the public for disclosure with films such as The Day the Earth Stood Still and the like? Are you aware of that?
Yeah, I knew of it. In fact, when we were given a briefing into this program back in '78, they mentioned that they had a presentation in the film that we were watching, 7 or 8 minutes on it. And one of the first movies that they wanted to release, the government, I believe the Air Force, assisted in the making of The Day the Earth Stood Still, the first one back in whenever it was, 1951 or 2 or whenever it was, the early 50s, I think. Anyways, the government cooperated with the film manufacturer, even giving the producer the size of the craft that should be displayed in the movie. Now, where they got that from, who knows? And so that was the first movie that the government assisted in making on this project of disclosure, which the government wanted. Truman wanted it. Eisenhower wanted it. But it was slow in the process. But I think at some point down the road, the government realized that if they released it, the government sat down and said, okay, here's what we know about extraterrestrials and UFOs, they would cause some kind of worldwide panic. And that's why at some point along the way, it was squashed.
And that's interesting because there was another film of that time, Earth versus the Flying Saucers, which is a little more over-the-top, typical alien invasion movie, which was based on one of Kehoe's books, Donald Kehoe, who was the head of NICAP and one of the, I suppose, bigger popularizers of extraterrestrial hypothesis back in the 50s, which brings me, I guess, to my next question. There's so many key figures in the dissemination or the popularization, yourself included, of UFO belief who have a military and or intelligence background. So Donald Kehoe's another example. You're obviously an example. William Cooper's obviously an example. Kevin Randall, Charles Hall. Corso would be another fantastic example, actually. Are there people that when you hear the stories, you're like, okay, that's somebody who's under direction to disseminate either disinformation or maybe is going their own way to move closer to disclosure, or do you have a sense of, from literally probably the last 70 years, because as I said, military folk have always seemed to be at the head of so much of the information that comes out to the public?
Well, the ones that were briefed into the program, when I was briefed in the program, there were 122 of us.
Okay.
In the intelligence community that was briefed in. So there was 122 of us that knew the story, knew everything. Now that doesn't count. That's field investigators. That doesn't count the possible generals, colonels, and generals, and GMs, upper echelon civilian employees in the Pentagon or in the Defense Intelligence or the CIA. But I knew there was 122. None of those 122 that I knew of at that time. Now, since that time, a lot of them have died, but none of them have ever written a book because the government won't let them. Like, I've tried to write a book. I mean, I submitted a manuscript and I'm going to hell with it. So I look at it that way. If a person had access and need to know and had been involved in the subject and they wrote something, and there hasn't been any of them that I've seen, then I would now, except for what's his name, Colonel Corso. Yeah, Colonel Corso. Now Corso was involved.
Okay.
There was a couple people that told me. Of course, it was way before my time, but a couple people, senior people, two people still alive, they're in their 90s, told me that Corso was involved in the subject. He did have knowledge. He did have access. Some of the things that Corso said, you scratch your head because the bodies never went to Fort Riley. That never happened.
Okay.
So some of the things he said is not factual, but some of the other things that he did during his career was in fact true. So Corso, a lot of things that he said in his book, I mean, a well-written book, but there's some things in there that's you got to scratch your head with too, but there's a lot of things in there that is true that other people have told me, yeah, that's factual. He was involved. But that's it. Some of these other people, Schmidt and some of these other guys, they, just because they were in the military doesn't mean they had access to anything. They might have seen something while they were in the military. They might have tried to get access, but wasn't allowed to get access. Or maybe they had access on a limited basis or something. And now they write a book about speculating or reciting somebody else's belief, but not their own because they didn't have any access to it. Those people, I don't even read their books because it's not going to be factual. I know what happened. I'm content with what I know, and I'm satisfied with it.
And one other, I suppose, related question to that: do you think organizations like NICAP, for example, who had a very heavy military intelligence membership on their board, were used as a way of either controlling the dissemination of UFO information or maybe collecting UFO information and feeding it back to the military at that relatively early time in the flying saucer experience, I guess?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. NICAP and APRO were used by the intelligence community to collect intelligence. Absolutely, 100%. They had penetrated those organizations, and one of the reasons they did because the government didn't want to be surprised by something. They didn't want to be surprised by maybe a report of something that we were testing, such as you mentioned the U-2 or the SR-71. Or the F-117 or some of the other things, that the classified drone program and so forth and so on. And so we wanted to know, the intelligence community wanted to know everything that was going on within these UFO groups. And that's why they penetrated. It was easy to do. You could recruit these people easily, especially the military people. The ex-military people are the easiest to recruit. And then sometimes you recruit people in an unwitting way. They don't know they're working for the government intelligence agency. They think they're working for a news organization or some other entity, and they open up. You establish good rapport with somebody, they're going to open up and give you what they have. And that's what happened within NICAP, APRO, CAUSE, and MUFON.
Huh. And do you think that's happening today in those organizations and or in, say, I guess to the Stars Academy is the big new player in the field today? I know that's kind of almost in bed now with, I guess, for lack of a better term, the military-industrial complex, but do you suspect that there's more going on with to the Stars Academy than the way it's presented, or?
I'm sure it's still happening today. I mean, I left the intelligence service a long time ago. I can't say for sure what's going on. I mean, I still have friends in the intelligence. I'm still a member of the Retired Intelligence Officer Association, and we meet and we talk about different things. And there's some current members current people that are involved in intelligence that I maintain contact with. And I'm sure it's still happening today. And that's a good way of keeping track of what's occurring and what is being reported to these UFO agencies. Yeah, I'm almost positive. Now, to the stars, I think they have some people that are connected to them that could be controversial. Yes, but I'm not a member, and so I'm just guessing and standing on the outside looking in. So I can't say for sure.
Well, we definitely need a book or an autobiography from you sometime soon, Richard, so fingers crossed that whatever security channels you need to clear are cleared in a not too distant future, because I'd be the first in line to buy it, I can tell you that right now.
Well, I've written a very, very, very good book, the manuscript, and 600 some pages, and when I submitted it for clearance, they classified about half of them. So, and then the other 300 pages or so, they redacted, 577 sentences and, 38 or 68 paragraphs. And so I'm fighting that right now. And so I'm just hopefully by December, I can get something out.
Oh, wow. I'd love to have you back on when that book comes out. And to be honest, even if that book never gets clearance, I'd love to have you on again, because I could talk to you for another hour easily. But thank you so much for coming onto the show today.
Okay, you're very, very welcome. You're very welcome.
As an historian of UFO belief, chatting to Richard Doty was probably akin to a Civil War historian chatting to Stonewall Jackson. Yes, I do think he's that important to our understanding of the phenomenon, and particularly the current beliefs around it. We will ask Richard back on the show when and if his book is finally cleared and released. I know that I'm not the only person with an interest in the phenomenon who is super eager to read it. In the meantime, if you're interested in learning more about the Bennewitz Affair, pick up a copy of Greg Bishop's Project Beta, the story of Paul Bennewitz, national security, and the creation of a modern UFO myth. Don't forget, you can always find us at talkingweird.com. If you haven't already, please like the show on Facebook and Instagram at Talking Weird Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Talking Weird. We're available on most podcast platforms and YouTube. If you enjoy the show, Jen and I would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review. And next week, make sure to listen in when Adam Benedict, author of Monsters in Print and founder of the Pine Barrens Institute, will be joining us to chat all things cryptid. It's going to be a blast. Until then, stay safe and...
keep it